continue our focus on the budget 2022 that was delivered a little earlier this afternoon by the Finance Minister. Economist and education specialist Dr. David Makova still joins me in studio. Also joining the conversation is Peter Attard Montalto, who is the Chief Economist at Intellidex. Let's kick it off again in studio with you, Peter. I want to talk about the personal tax and just what it practically means in terms of what's going to end up in people's pockets, the adjusted personal tax brackets in line with inflation.
Absolutely. So what the minister said is practically we're not going to be increasing taxes on any individuals, and that means all the tax brackets that we have are basically going to be shifted by 4.5% to take into account the inflationary aspect. So it's even Stevens for everyone. On a nominal basis, you'll get more money in your bank account, but really nothing has changed substantively. It's just an inflationary adjustment.
Peter, when you look at some of the announcements around tax this year, have those been in line with what perhaps you may have expected?
So we're seeing a lot of conservatism, certainly from Treasury, around the pace of the roll-off from this terms of trade mining price boon for the fiscus, which I think is correct overall. But so the numbers are roughly in line on revenues with their expectations. The concern is they're spending about 80% of the increase in revenue on increased expenditure, as opposed to the 50-50, I think, that people thought between expenditure and debt consolidation originally. And I think they can basically get away with that because the debt profile is looking okay-ish overall. There are obviously very large caveats around that. But as you say, some ability to play some interesting games within the tax side, being able to still do this corporation tax cut, being able to offer this quite sizable fuel levy relief, which is so important at the moment. Now that we have such a spike in petrol prices coming, 125 cents probably coming into March now as well.
Of course, it's not the decrease that some of the unions and civil society organizations may have been asking for. I'm talking about the fuel tax levy there. But do you think this will be enough to stave off criticism around the fuel levy and the lobbying that we've seen over the last couple of months especially?
Probably not. As the Russia-Ukraine situation drags on, as we see the oil price still remaining pretty high, or even higher than here, the petrol prices are continuing to climb, now probably next month over 21 rand per litre. So no, I don't think the pressure is going to go away. It's provides some marginal respite. Originally we expected maybe around a 45-50 cent increase in April. Now we will see just on tax. Now we won't see that increase coming through. So no, I don't think it really removes that pressure. It's the same on the bracket creep as well, actually. Inflation through the next fiscal year actually probably won't be 4.5%. It will probably be 5 or just above 5, again, given those higher petrol prices. So there is going to be a little bit of sneaky, I think, clawback on the inflation front underneath us all when we look back in a year's time.
David, ultimately, when we look at what the big issues in this country are, a lot of it centers around the ability of the economy to grow and effectively create jobs for the millions of people that are unemployed. Should we be worried that I think everybody so far this afternoon has described this budget as a conservative budget? What does it mean then for what is needed, which is, some would say, a radical shift when it comes to the growth of our economy?
Well, the gist of it is you have to create the wealth before you can redistribute it. And we give it a fancy name. We call it economic growth, this job creation, etc., and so forth. The challenge we face is that's not a silver bullet. You can't do it overnight. And we've come from a very, very difficult 10 years. What the minister is trying to do is consolidate our position and put us in a position where we can be bolder. So I'm just going to give a bit of a short history lesson. We've got our debt to GDP currently going to peak around 75%. That's a tough situation to be in as a developing country. We were in a much stronger position. If we had to go back to, let's say, 2006, 2007, our debt to GDP was 25%. We had much more scope to weather the international financial crisis. We're not in that situation now. So as much as I'm critical in the sense that this budget is very, very conservative, it's a savings budget. We have to save. We've got to manage our finances well. And that helps us to consolidate. But this budget is not going to get us into the transformational nation that we're trying to build. That's something bolder that's required, that talks exactly to economic growth, to job creation. Maybe this year is not the year, but certainly by next year or the year thereafter, we need to be seeing some really bold moves in that regard.
Peter, with that in mind, it seems that Minister Godongwana has very much then followed in the footsteps laid by his predecessor, Tito Mboweni. I don't know if you would agree with that sentiment. And if so, what does this do for the sentiment which was shared about basically the budget being a budget of austerity? We saw this last year after the delivery of the budget this time last year in February. So when we compare then to what has changed this year, do you think that the minister is likely to come under fire from some sectors of society who say we're not going to get out of this crisis if we're not spending?
Oh, sure. Now, the minister will always come under fire from the usual suspects who think that the SAR will just magically print the money that can be spent. But no, I mean, I think overall the market's business is quite happy with this balance, a little bit of extra spending coming through, a little bit of consolidation, some sensible chatter on taxes. But I wouldn't really describe this as a very clear budget overall. I mean, a lot of the extra spending coming through is actually largely on one-offs. There's a lot of spending piled in for the next 2 years around wage adjustments, which are actually already kind of known. They had to do this at the NTPS last year, but they didn't fully pencil in all the numbers. And that's a lot of what's actually been pushed down into education and health is actually on wages. It's not, and for wages for existing employees as opposed to new hiring. It's not really transformational spending coming through. For the SRD, which Treasury, of course, positions as a one-off, but is the largest sort of hole then in future years, as we may well, of course, see it extended or turned into something else from 2023, 24 onwards. So it's a sort of a very odd budget on the surface as a result. And I think it doesn't really tell us, for instance, were the cuts, the very large cuts that probably did affect service delivery in the budget a year ago in 2021, were they correct or did they need to be reversed? There's not much evidence of them being reversed fully. Or prioritization. We see no zero-based budgeting going on here at all. There's no real sense of prioritization of choosing which program should happen and which program should get more money. So we're still actually stuck in quite an odd and somewhat broken place, I think, in terms of the fiscal machine. But the headline numbers, which the market ultimately cares about, are fine. And that's, I think, the takeaway.
One of the industries, David, that is not happy tonight is the sugar industry. They've long been complaining about the sugar tax, and it's just been hiked. And, you know, there's ongoing concern about an industry that is on the decline as a result of this tax.
Yeah. So the logic of the sugar industry is that this tax is opportunistic, that as much as it's levied, actually the impact in terms of consumer habits and how the government spends the money is not directed towards making people healthier, etc., and so forth. So it's understandable that they're unhappy about it. We have this every year with sin taxes, adult beverages, alcoholic beverages. The sugar tax and the sugar industry is now just within that specific category. I think what we can hope for, which goes beyond the budget, is that the manufacturers of processed food products actually now start reducing the amount of sugar within their products, and that hopefully results in healthier outcomes for all of us because they're trying to save money at the same time. But I think the sector sees this as opportunistic and another way of getting money, whereas the way the money is applied is not directly linked to that.
Of course, you know, part of the reasoning that is often given by the sugar industry is that the higher you increase the taxes, the more jobs effectively you are taking out of the sector. So it seems to almost be a mutually exclusive thing, that one comes as a direct result of the other.
Absolutely, but it's, again, that's an argument that you could apply to multiple sectors. We could go to the education sector and say the government should tax the education sector a lot less. We can create more jobs. Ultimately, the budget is a balancing act. And I always provoke my students. I use a very, very simplistic example. It's a binary one, but it makes the point. If you've got a child and you can either give them medical aid or send them to a private school. What would you choose? You can't balance it. What would you choose? And that talks to prioritization, and they always fight with me, it's not fair, it's a middle-class question. But ultimately, that's what we're trying to achieve in this budget. And on balance, as a consolidation budget, I think the minister's done a fair job. 7 out of 10, I would say. From a boldness perspective, there's an incredible amount of work we've got to do as a country going forward.
Peter, let me come to you. I mean, in many ways, a lot of what happens next is not just going to rest with the minister, but also with his colleagues in cabinet in terms of increasing efficiencies and capabilities when it comes to the execution of their jobs. And that seems to be the biggest challenge that is facing government right now, because if there's not necessarily more money coming, I imagine many were hopeful when the news of the surplus became public. But if there isn't that much more money going towards these different allocations for departments, then everybody has to make the most with what they have.
Well, that's the interesting question, I think, as we go towards 2023, 2024 and beyond, as we pencil in this primary fiscal surplus. But is that politically possible? It notionally on the surface implies you have money to spend on your political pet projects. Now, of course, it doesn't actually. You have to run quite a large primary fiscal surplus actually just to reduce the debt to GDP level. But the political nature of it is going to be quite challenging, I think, and that's why I don't think actually it is possible in the long run to run a primary fiscal surplus. It's going to play into the basic income grant debate, which of course is not going away. And of course, these other much bigger spending, potential spending pots or holes, NHI about 500 billion per year, National Social Security Fund spending, which could be $1 trillion per year in the long term. All these things are on the horizon and not dealt with here in this budget. And of course, then just the simple underlying expenditure demands. I mean, the country needs to be spending about 20 to 30 billion per year just simply on national level water investment, which is not happening at all at the moment. So there is this wall of demands really for additional expenditure, which are being kept at bay, which again on the macro level is good in terms of the sort of fiscal stability and the stabilization of debt to GDP, but in terms of outcomes certainly is not good, and that's where we are disappointed we're not seeing the prioritization which would cut programs elsewhere to allow some of this other necessary spending to happen.
Peter, let me thank you so much for your time. Peter Attard Montalto is the chief economist at Intellidex. Dr. David Makova is an economist and education specialist. Thank you too for your time tonight.